like the lady said, my name's Waldo Roeg. I'm what they call, where I come from, a senior peer recovery trainer. And I actually work at a big trust in central North London called Central North West London NHS Foundation Trust. It sort of covers about 2/3 of London, so it's very, very big. It was wonderful listening to Mark earlier. He was a real inspiration, I think, and I'm involved in peer support, and I think modelling an element of hope and possibility is a big part of what we're involved in and what I'm involved in, and he really modelled that hope, I think, really well for people. So I thought I'd start by telling you a little bit about myself, really, and my recovery journey, and then talking a little bit about what we're doing in the recovery college that I work with. So like I said, I currently work as a peer recovery trainer at Central North West London's NHS Foundation Trust, their recovery and wellbeing college. And I guess it started as a recovery college, it's now recovery and wellbeing, so it can cover all sorts of long-term conditions, and so from the devastation of physical conditions like Mark to the devastation that a diagnosis of mental health can have on people. And I've also become a consultant, really, for IMROC, which is an organisation implementing recovery through organisational change and trying to help organisations that deliver social services in our country really change and to accept an element of that model of peer support and the possibility that recovery and living with a condition is a possibility, regardless and in spite of either being in a wheelchair or the mental difficulties that people can struggle with. I've had the opportunity now to work alongside some of the best people I've ever worked with, and sharing their passion has been a huge part of what has inspired me in my own recovery over the last few years. I used services, and I'm still using services, and I've used them for the last 35 years, for both drug and substance misuse, and for my mental health, and a large part of that was diagnosis of drug-induced psychosis and hospital stays. It all started when I was a teenager, and I sort of came from an affluent family who was involved in films, and I then myself went into the film business and had a very good career in it for 25 years. But I learnt very well how to hide my problems, and I guess that can't last forever, and they came out. And 18 years ago now, I had a major breakdown and really lost everything. I became bankrupt, so I lost my home, I lost my career as I'd been found out. I lost my partner, family, dignity, and status in society. And I guess most of all, I lost myself. I ended up living on the streets with only the clothes that I stood up in. And I moved really from one dealer to another, doing odd jobs for them for measly bits of drugs and the crumbs from their tables, turning to petty crime to fund my meagre existence. I ended up in constant conflict with law enforcement, in and out of police cells. My only goal really was to survive. My existence then was so precarious, I really didn't want to do anything to improve my situation and risk what little I had, as it might mean that it would rebound on me badly. I learnt really that any efforts that I did to improve my situation were worth very little. I felt I'd become worthless and became very cautious about making any moves to progress. All the stigma that's associated with mental health and my misuse of substances was also made 100% worse by being in poverty and so reliant on state benefits and state aid. And that's actually in our country only very little, because I was of no fixed abode at the time. I was made to feel pretty worthless by the services that I went to see, who only really saw me as another worthless, mad junkie from the streets. They tried to mitigate my symptoms with medication, and that sort of made me believe that that's what it was going to be like for the rest of my life. And my interaction with services that became minimal and just enough to ensure a supply of medication. I did just enough to survive and became acclimatized that and sort of grew into that person. My own sense of shame and stigma was such that I adopted the way of the street, just to hide really and be able to identify with something. I worked out it was easier to stop short of doing anything to better myself, as I thought it wouldn't yield sufficient gain to outweigh that extra effort. And this gave people the impression I was lazy. I lost any thought of being accepted in wider society. My expectations around myself were zero, and the expectations of everyone around me, and including the services, were also rarely at zero. I was lost, and I felt as though all the possibilities of my life had ended and now were far beyond any of my reach. I told myself that at 42, I'd sort of semi-retired. I'd had a good career in films, but now that was over and I was going to do something else, which was nothing really, but that's what people did when they retired. I had been going in and out of hospital, and after my last admission, I finally sort of surrendered and gave myself up entirely to services and agreed to do anything that they demanded of me, really, and they put me at first into a hostel. Well, this was the first stable roof I'd had for a couple of years, so it meant I could claim some state benefits and have a bit of a small but steady income. And they started to process and started to think about not only sending me to groups, but rehousing me. And in this hostel, I was very lucky, and I guess because I met another resident while I was there, and she was the first person who in years didn't just view me as a mad junkie on the streets. She'd been utterly non-judgmental and actually seemed to be impressed by me. Well, we had a baby whilst we were in the hostel, and after a couple of years, we went into temporary accommodation. And that was for another period of a couple of years before we were given any sort of stable housing. But when we were, it was a place of our own, and it made a huge difference to us. The stability allowed me to get on top of my drug taking, but my mental health was still suffering at the time. I was still struggling daily and isolating myself indoors, and having a baby meant I had an excuse to stay indoors. The constant struggle to survive sapped sort of all the hope that I could muster. There were times when the constant worry about benefits, finding the rent, possibility of losing the housing, and whether or not there'd be enough to eat was as bad for my mental health as it had been on the streets. But really, it was having that baby to look after that gave me an element of something to live for. We were finally rehoused permanently in 2005, but I continued to use services, but felt it was on a treadmill that was going nowhere. Expectations around what I could do were very low. I'd left school with no qualifications, quite young, and only worked in the arts, which didn't require any sort of qualifications to work in, and felt I'd been left on the shelf, really, of possibilities. Well, eventually I was asked if I wanted to do a work placement, and in our trust we have some fantastic vocational services helping people back into work. And the low expectations that I had of myself, I had only agreed to do this if they guaranteed it wouldn't lead to me having work. That I would be able to continue maybe volunteering afterwards, but it didn't mean that I was going to be thrown off my benefits and forced to do shelf stacking in a supermarket. The thought of what working might do to my state benefits and the risk of being financially worse off terrified me. But they agreed to my conditions, and I went to do a placement in, at the time, community day services, which was a day service for people with mental health difficulties that could go in and be supported in the community and have a place to go. And I started doing that for one afternoon a week. In the afternoons, because of the medication I was taking, it meant that I wasn't very well in the mornings. And when I arrived, I was given a set of keys to the building. And this was the first time in a long time that I felt trusted, especially with a building full of computers. It was the first time I was being valued and treated with any dignity and respect. And I suppose really it was the first time I had any interactions with some practitioners who were really recovery focused or had belief in people and had a belief in me. What's more, the staff listened to me when I spoke up. I was rarely made to feel a part of the team, and this very different relationship had huge implications for me. It wasn't long before I started volunteering. I did the 4-month placement. They didn't put me into work, but they allowed me to volunteer. And I started volunteering in the end for 3 days a week at the day centre and started really discovering what it meant to be a peer support worker. I was working in the drop-in, and the drop-in materially changed over the sort of year that I'd worked there. And I'd been accepted there by them at first with great sort of trepidation as another mad junkie that's going to be working here or volunteering to support us, to one that really was able to model an element of recovery, so learning what that meant. I was using my own experiences to model a sense of hope that recovery could be a possibility for people using the centre. And being able to do this really fired my enthusiasm and passion, and I soon found myself with a determined goal. I'd been on the receiving end of help for such a long time that I'd forgotten just how powerful being in a position to help others can be, even if this is just making a cup of tea for someone. Well, the volunteer work gave me access to training, and I started accessing the mental health training that staff have in our big NHS trust. I also had my first experience with what we call a wellness recovery action plan. I'm sure you might have heard of this as RAP, and a sort of self-management plan that the community day services I was volunteering in wanted to start to develop this to support people in the community. I found there were so many strategies I'd been using to survive without really realizing it. And having a plan and being conscious of them allowed me to start to thrive rather than just to survive. I began to learn how to manage my own difficulties and how to get the best out of my own situation. Getting involved with this rap thing really led to my first real experience of what we call in our country co-production, or a sort of collaboration between services and people that use those services. I was doing it with a group of staff and members of the community drop-in and community services that I was volunteering in, collaborated to create our own version of RAP, which we now call our health and well-being plans. They're now used across the trust that I work in and have led to all sorts of opportunities for me. And finally, peer support. I'd found something I wanted to do and felt that I was good at. I was able to access the first peer support training program that our trusts brought in, and this was the first time I'd undertaken any sort of academic training, and I completed it. I was asked to be a part of our trust's bid to be the initial to be a part of bringing IMROC, Implementing Recovery Through Organisational Change, program into our trust to help support our trust change organisationally, both the nature of its workforce, and to think about bringing recovery education and recovery colleges into our trust. And to look at a little bit more about how recovery approaches around risk could be changed. Well, involvement with these endeavours at our trust led to me becoming a consultant with IMROC, with the IMROC team, providing support to other organisations across the United Kingdom in their quest to develop recovery-focused practices. So I've been really lucky, I guess, to have been at the forefront of it. Finally, I took the plunge and went back to work, and I was employed as a peer recovery trainer with the Trust when we opened our Recovery and Wellbeing College in 2012. These weren't sheltered positions. I was recruited like any other member of staff. However, I was supported in finding the right amount of hours so that I was assured of being better off financially in work. And also, I suppose, for the first time in our trust, the qualification for the job, which I seemed to have, was to have a lived experience of using mental health services, which was a great opportunity. I'd been to that university, that's for sure. And this opened up a whole load of new horizons for me with a host of new opportunities. It's given me a new sense of hope, and although I don't earn a great deal, it's enough to enable me to thrive. I'm a contributing citizen, putting skills I have to good use. I'm building on what's strong in me rather than what's wrong in me, and I still take medication, and I find some things a real struggle. But I'm now someone who both uses services and helps to deliver those services. And in both of those roles, I've witnessed many changes, both in our services in the Trust, but also in myself. I was once asked to write a list of things that have helped me in my own recovery journey, and they are acceptance and feeling a part of the community, both at home and work, and feeling that you belong. I suppose connections, really. A feeling of independence, a self-management plan, being confident to advocate for myself, being valued for what I can contribute, moving from feeling grateful to people to discovering I have qualities that can be valued. Stable housing, being an active citizen and feeling my social status is not less than the people that support me, and overcoming my own stigma and shame around that, and gaining a sense of momentum. Having a small group of people that looked at me differently, that helped me to look differently at myself, and I guess changing attitudes and a change of a use of language. Most of these things cost absolutely nothing extra to our trust. For the most part, they're about a different sort of interaction and with different relationships. The Recovery College where I work and others like it embodies so many of the things that have helped me in my journey of recovery. Patients become students and relationships are transformed through co-production. They challenge stigma and genuinely recognize the strengths and the contribution that everybody can make. And I'm not alone. I've got a lot of colleagues that have started this with me, and we're now a 50-50 team. But some of our peers have had really difficult experiences in services. And Sue, first experience was of being detained and sectioned at 16. And she came out of that experience feeling that she never wanted to go back. It had been so horrendous, and vowed she'd never return. She went back to college, did a psychology degree, but then could never actually use it because she became immediately extremely ill again afterwards. She had her children taken away from her. She became unemployed. She was viewed as just another psychiatric patient. She jumped off Westminster Bridge on many occasions and was fished out of it and taken to the hospital and detained again. And finding an element of hope was very, very hard. But until she came into contact with recovery-focused practitioners, it wasn't going to happen. And she, like me, started to become involved in services and also was on that first peer support program that I spoke about, and has now found some hope from an inspiration from peers who go through similar experiences, finding an element of control over her difficulties and being able to manage those difficulties, and finding opportunities. She's now our major senior peer at the Recovery College and has been a peer support worker on the wards for 3 years. And as a result, is on our Trust's Board of Ethics and decides elements of ethics that are really quite complicated. Is on a reference group and is rewriting how they do restraint and de-escalation training in our trust, and trying to think of what lived experience can bring to that element of practice. It's a practice that at times there's a necessity for, but has been abused enormously in our hospitals. And is a peer consultant for the Royal College of Psychiatry in looking at how we can bring co-production into the doctor's training curriculum with it, and is re-qualified as a psychologist, even though she's working as a peer, which is fantastic. I think this is a quote from one of the students in our Recovery College, and recovery for me is an ongoing journey of understanding and managing my mental health, or any other aspect of my life, by taking control of it so that I can live a more meaningful and a happier life. And I just think of what Mark was talking about earlier, and it's about taking back an element of control over his life that has enabled an element of hope to be forthcoming within it. Our Recovery College is entirely based on an element of hope, control and opportunity. And really that's a hope in believing that possibilities, that things can be better. And so much of that is modeled through the peers that work within that sphere. And the opportunity to feel a part of the world again, rebuilding a sense of self. And an element of control, or have some agency over the difficulties that we have and the challenges that we face. So there are some defining features that we've put together through IMROC, really, around what we believe a recovery college should be. And they're all based on educational principles, so people come as students rather than patients or service users. There's a prospectus and a clear structure with lesson plans and learning plans, and it's sort of structured as a college in that there are courses and terms. It doesn't replace therapy, and it doesn't replace mainstream education. So we believe we should practice alongside and be complementary to those things. So what we do in the Recovery College, you couldn't find within mainstream education, because that's where people should find that. And it doesn't replace therapy, and there is a very good reason to have therapies for some things. But it must be based on co-production, co-facilitation, and co-learning. Our team is 50-50, so 50% it's practitioners, occupational therapists, psychologists, and 50% it's people with lived experience. They devise, design, facilitate, and do all of the work in a collaborative way within the Recovery College. It's all based on strengths, and strengths-based and person-centered. Progressive, so people work towards their goals and have some goals to work towards. It's integrated into the community and mental health services, so there's an active engagement with mental health services and community organizations, building and nurturing those partnerships. And it's inclusive and open to all, and is free to anyone that works in our trust or has had services delivered to from the trust, or cares for someone in the trust, and is free for a year after they've been discharged. So really trying to create inclusivity. It's open to all different types of cultures. And I guess thinking of today's thing, loneliness and mental health, we know that loneliness puts individuals at greater risk of mental decline. Studies have said that 64% increased chance of developing clinical dementia through loneliness. Lonely individuals are more prone to depression. Loneliness and low social interaction can be predictive of suicide in older age. How do we create connections for people? How do we create those connections that they say in the UK that people with mental health difficulties die 20 years younger, partly through these disconnections. So we think about access and access for everybody. And Recovery College and peer interventions are open, and the co-production is a driver for social inclusion. So using people that are used to being helpless in services and actually having their involvement in designing those services and really thinking about what our core economy is and bringing our communities in to serve themselves is a big part of what we think about within recovery and co-production. Overcoming that stigma and self-shame, and there's no better place than the Recovery College, where we have classrooms with people with lived experience of their difficulties sitting, learning alongside practitioners, and the sort of breaking down of those barriers between those that deliver and are experts and have all the knowledge and those that are supposed to just be receptacle to that is an enormous learning experience for both parties, and the stigma that dissolves within that arena is palpable. Mental health has the highest levels of digital exclusion. So, people often will tell us they have an email address, but they don't access that email address every day. It's very easy to have one, but unless you have a computer or you need to look at it, if you don't get an email, then you don't look at it. I look at my emails all the time because of work, but generally that's where I look at that's the only emails that I look at. But huge levels of digital exclusion and social loneliness is experienced when we lack a wider network of groups. People come, though, as students, and they have an interaction as a student and take that beyond the Recovery College as well. So they will make friends as students, and they will therefore make connections that they can take on outside. We have a lot of partnerships and partnership work that we do within our Recovery and Wellbeing College, and I guess to a great extent some of the social media and the digital world has given us a lot of opportunities. The Rix Center was started by a very well-known man in the UK, Lord Rix, who recently passed away, around learning disabilities and looking at how to support people with learning difficulties. And the similarities between that and people that have been for a very long time in hospital with mental health difficulties is very similar. So how can we find ways for people that struggle with language to advocate for themselves in a different way? So we've looked at different digital technologies and created our health and well-being plan within a what we call a wiki, enabling users to advocate for their needs on a digital platform, and allowing people to choose how they make contacts, a bit like Facebook. So people can also upload interactive features like films and pictures and sound clips, and that starts a totally different conversation. People only take photographs of the things that they celebrate. They don't celebrate things that they really don't like. So immediately you start on a conversation around what's strong rather than what's wrong. So we use them thinking about how we can get people at their own homes. The whole point of our Recovery and Wellbeing College, I suppose, is to have that interaction in our classroom where there is a breakdown in those barriers, those barriers that stop people interacting between service users and service deliverers. People always say to us, yes, that we love that idea, but my son or the person that I care for won't come out of their house. How can he access the Recovery College? And looking at how we can use digital media and apps and video conferencing where people can interact as a classroom, even if they are on their own, whether that's Skype, whether that's Twitter or Periscope, Facebook, is a big part of what we're looking at to help people access things if they're not able to actually physically come at some points in their life. And also thinking about virtual reality. And this is a big new idea, I think, in the UK that people are looking at within the mental health world. Lots of talk around how it can be used in psychosis. We're looking at how to create different ways of using that within our classroom. We've been looking at how to create programs for people with dementia to recall their life. So had someone from Jerusalem and actually been able to take them back to Jerusalem to jog memories and to take them back, and using that is an extraordinary experience. I don't know if anyone's tried virtual reality, but it is just like being there. But we've also been thinking about how to use it with our staff in their de-escalation training. So really looking at how we can bring a lot of our digital things to bring people together, bring people in. Well, yes, 8 seconds, and thank you for that. Yeah, thank you.